Welcome sports fans to GenX Classic Sports, where we bring the nostalgia of our sports-filled youth into the present day. Grab your favorite retro jersey, crack open a cold one, and let's stroll down memory lane together.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to GenX Classic Sports. This will be episode 31. And look, if you're not a Cowboys fan, I get it. I mean, they have done a lot of things over the years that understandably make people hate them. I get it. But, you know, I was born into a Cowboys family, as were my friends. And I went to a game for the first time in 1978. And so I've been a Cowboys fan ever since. And, you know, I was young, but lived through the fun times of the 70s, going to Super Bowls. And then in the 80s, it wasn't fun at all. My entire time in school with buddies and all in junior high and high school, I got picked on for being a Cowboys fan because they were not very good. So this Netflix documentary comes out, and we've all watched it. And so my buddies and I, David, Mark, my brother Casey, we've all sat down and we've had a discussion about what we noticed in the Netflix documentary and our memories of the actual events that happened. So I understand, you know, if you're a Cowboys fan, maybe you'll learn something from this, or if you haven't seen the documentary, maybe you'll learn something from this. But that's what we're going to do to kick off football season this year. And it's going to be a two-parter. And as I've mentioned on social media, we will move to a weekly format for the rest of the year, hopefully, because there's just so much content during football season. So I appreciate you listening at all. As always, please, it helps us out tremendously. If you listen to a video on YouTube or you listen to a video on Spotify, doesn't matter. Please subscribe. Please click like, thumbs up, whatever you have on that system, and that'll help us tremendously as we grow the podcast. So thank you very much. We appreciate you listening like you wouldn't believe, and let's go talk about some football with episode 31. Thank you. We all took notes. We all remember. We all watched the documentary about the Cowboys. So let's talk about what we thought about the Dallas Cowboys documentary that apparently Jerry Jones had editorial control over. So what do y'all think? I wrote down a couple of things. Some of y'all might have. Let me tell you what the first thing was that I found. So it covered a lot of time, but it started talking about Jerry buying the team, and it had some flashback moments in it, and I don't know how many episodes over into there it was, but the first thing that I noticed was Jerry getting really emotional, talking about his turning point, and kind of a turning point in his life was when Arkansas won the national championship in football, and he got real emotional talking about how none of the guys on the team were ever the same again. And that's when he decided he really wanted to get into professional sports. So that was my impression that was clearly a big event in his life because he referenced it so many times. Anybody else got something that jumped out at you early?
He claimed he changed that feeling. Chased that feeling for the rest of his life, didn't he? Or, you know.
Yeah, he dedicated his life to chasing it and finding that feeling again. That was really the most emotional he was in the whole documentary, was flashing back to winning it at Arkansas. Speaking of that, and speaking of the Arkansas thing, did y'all know that he had a master's degree and that his master's had been in sports promotion or whatever he had written that paper about? They showed actual pieces of it where he had written out what he thought needed to be done to promote a professional football team, because he says in there at some point that pro football owners were just kind of like tax write-offs and hobbies for the owners, pro football teams. Do y'all have any thoughts about a guy in the 64 thinking that pro sports would be such a big deal and putting that much thought into how to do that?
That's pretty forward thinking for that time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, NFL was not that old as far as the national, you know, college football was more popular than the NFL for a long, long, long time. So he was putting a lot of thought into where the future could lead for pro football for sure. Anybody up, Mark? What was something early that jumped out at you as a talking point?
Well, I go back to that too. Is I just thought he went straight to the oil business. That's what he was concentrating in. But I didn't know until the documentary that that's what his major was.
Yeah, I think it was his master's, wasn't it? Was
right.
Sports, whatever. Yeah. I mean, they didn't get into the whole timeline necessarily, but I know that he left college and ended up in the oil industry, and he had tried to. He told that whole story about trying to buy the Chargers and getting involved with the mafia, and his dad did not like that at all, so he backed off. That's the first time I'd ever heard that part too. But it is interesting that as a young man, he was really thinking about what it would take to be successful with an NFL franchise. And that was good because it flashed back to the sort of the mindset of a guy that was probably 22 years old at the time. Casey, you're quiet. What you got? Nothing? No impressions?
No.
Anything about, since I started with Jerry's early years, is there anything about him sort of as a young man that surprised you, or, I don't know, the quest to buy a team and all that?
I thought it was just interesting his early beginnings and how he just didn't have that background, and how all those things kind of lined up and led him to that point. All the oil business and all the other things.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't say it, but it kind of makes the case that he did the oil thing
right.
to fund what he really wanted
right.
to do in life.
That he kind of had to have had some kind of plan to put all that together, right? Or go in that direction.
Absolutely. So I guess let's do this. I guess it would help us stay organized if we kind of went chronological. So that's sort of whether not chronologically as far as the documentary, because it skipped around a lot, but chronologically sort of how we know this happened. So we know that Jerry and Jimmy, we won't have to rehash all that. We know Jerry and Jimmy were roommates and therefore sort of friends, and Jerry had this long-term plan of someday owning a team. We also know that Jimmy went out on his own and became really entrenched in coaching and so forth, while Jerry was out there wildcatting for the oil industry. So we know kind of how they got where they got to. So we don't have to talk about all that. But what jumps out at you guys about the actual process of Jerry buying the team and hiring Jimmy? I mean, we lived through that. The whole point of this podcast is that we're Gen Xers, and I can remember sitting in David's living room and his dad walking through and saying, "I can't believe that sorry SOB fired Tom Landry." And then, thinking about it, and he coming back through saying they will never win a Super Bowl with a college coach. I go down the street to our house. Dad was not a fan of Jimmy Johnson. If y'all will remember back in the day, they were really good. They won. I think they set a record at one time for consecutive home wins down in their stadium. But they beat people bad, and they were not call it what you want. They were flashy, and the thing is, Jimmy encouraged all that, and they just really skull-dragged people and enjoyed taunting and all that kind of stuff. Not my dad's favorite coach. And so when this all happened, these men that had been Cowboys fans were not happy. I was kind of glad they had made a change at all because they needed to.
Oh, yeah.
They went 3-13 in Landry's last season to a half-empty stadium in Irving. Something needed to be done. And so what do y'all remember about that time? I think that's been a while, but I was a senior in high school when this happened. So you two were in college and you were in junior high. What do y'all remember about that whole process? Pre-ESPN days.
Well, first of all, I had no idea who Jerry Jones was.
Nobody did.
Unless you were an Arkansas fan that followed the 1964 Razorbacks.
Right.
How would you know?
Right.
And nobody else did.
Right. So you're sitting there watching this all unfold going, who's this guy? Who is this guy? Yeah. Understandable. You'd had to have been a hardcore fan to know the starting guard on 64, right? What else, Mark? Since you're the one talking, by the time we found out Jimmy was involved, what'd you think?
I was kind of like your dad. I was not a Miami fan.
Right.
You know, in the day they were
Flashy.
and that just wasn't college football to me back then. Now it's common, but
Aggressive. Jimmy encouraged did all that, right?
right, and he was going to do that with the Cowboys too.
Yeah. Which really it kind of turned out not so much because you get back then you got penalized a lot more for some stuff than you do now and this all that kind of stuff. But yeah, they were flashy. They taunted. They did all that kind of stuff. So they weren't popular with a lot of people. What about you?
Same way. I didn't like Jimmy Johnson. I didn't like the Miami Hurricanes for that reason. They were flashy, cocky, very brash, but they were supremely talented, no doubt. But I don't know. I guess maybe we were a little old school from what our parents thought. You know, they remember Tom Landry as a young man, probably as a player, and knew he was classy and all that. And they didn't want this Jimmy Johnson coming in, this arrogant guy encouraging this type of play. You know, it was unheard of at that time. So I wasn't impressed with it. And I'm like Mark, I didn't know who Jerry Jones was either. Didn't have a clue.
Well, so being a casual Razorback fan because of where we live, my impression about the Jimmy thing was that Arkansas had scheduled Miami back to back. And the first time they played them was in War Memorial in Little Rock. And I didn't, at the time you don't know this, but you find out over the years after with more books and articles written and the internet and all that. And then Jimmy wrote a book that I read. But Jimmy wanted the Arkansas job badly. And I think it was when Holtz got hired. And they brought him in and did the whole interview thing, and he left thinking this is my job. And then he found out from a reporter that Lou Holtz had been hired instead of him. And he was not happy. And I think it was Lou Holtz. And then later on when the Hatfield thing happened, I think it kind of came up again. Anyway, the bottom line was Jimmy was pretty hurt to be spurned by his alma mater. So when whoever scheduled Miami and Arkansas, when Arkansas hosted Miami, Wayne's not with us, but he could tell us the exact score, but it was something 51
to nothing.
51-0, yeah.
I thought it was 7. I thought Arkansas did score. Well, the point was there on national TV, Jimmy was clearly not concerned about running the score up either. He didn't call the dogs off whatsoever. And I'm not saying he should have. I'm just saying it didn't look like that was part of his concern. So, and then the next year, believe it or not, Arkansas goes down there and plays them a really good game. Probably should have won. I think it was 18-14 or something like that. I think Steve Atwater had a big interception in that game. They should have beat them. But so my impression was, well, Jerry Jones is an Arkansas, and Jimmy's really mad at the Razorbacks right now. What's this all about? Then you find out they're teammates and roommates, and you think friends and all that kind of stuff. So that's where I was with it. But, I mean, look, the Cowboys were bad. They were awful. They were awful when Jimmy took over. So something needed to be done. So as a fan, I was glad for a change, but that wasn't the change I necessarily wanted.
Well, you find out in that documentary that Tom Landry was, so out of touch. He didn't know some of the players' names. He pretty much let them do what they wanted to do in practice. If they didn't feel like practicing, he didn't push them or nothing, any of that, by the time, that came along. And I didn't know any of that at the time.
Yeah, and some of the guys that we're most aware of as Cowboys heroes were Randy White and some of these guys. They were still hanging on.
Right, drawing a paycheck.
And they didn't need to be.
Right.
And in that documentary, I did learn that Jimmy wrote all of them a letter saying, your time has come. You can either retire or we're going to cut you, right? And so a slew of guys retired. Danny White, Randy White, Too Tall Jones, on and on and on. And they needed to. So in that regard, it wasn't that upsetting to get rid of some, even though they were heroes, to get rid of some guys that needed to go. So, all right, so moving chronologically, let's talk about how they first handled their business. We know they did the Herschel trade and all that, But what I wrote down was, what was Jimmy's big advantage to stepping into the NFL and then running a draft for the first and second and maybe third times even? What advantage did he have over everybody in the NFL that doesn't get talked about enough?
He recruited most of those
He
kids for
recruited
college.
These guys that he's looking at coming out of college, he'd been in their living rooms. He'd met their
Right.
mamas. He's trying to bring Emmitt Smith was one of them. He tried to bring Emmitt to Miami.
Yeah.
He knew guys on every team in the NFL that turned out to be good players that he had recruited in high school. Of course, there were guys from his own schools. There was guys from – but that was a tremendous advantage over every even scouting department in the NFL, was that Jimmy knew these players and what they could and couldn't do. And so it took about 3 years for all of them to sort of graduate, that he'd kind of 3 or 4 years for them to finally float through the system. By then, he'd loaded the team down. What you got, Mark?
Well, you notice that he told Michael Irvin to get drafted somehow by the Cowboys if he got that call to take it, because he would be the next coach.
Yeah, and I think one of the funniest, speaking of all the players leaving and the influx of talent, the funniest thing in the whole thing to me was Michael Irvin saying, I already had the list ready. When Jimmy took over, I handed him the list and said, these, because Michael had played a year under Landry, he said, these guys have to go because they didn't live up to the Miami standard or the Cowboys standard, either one. So I thought that was pretty funny. But Jimmy coming in and seeing these names and knowing these guys was a major advantage. So that's why he was, plus the Herschel thing, that's why they rebuilt the roster with such good talent early on. So let's talk about, since we're talking about the documentary, what do y'all think about the fact that they put so much emphasis on the Steve Berline and Aikman drama, but they didn't even mention Aikman and Steve Walsh very much? That was the first big issue.
Right.
And for those listening that don't know, what happened in the draft when Jimmy took over? They drafted Aikman first, which was a no-brainer, but then what happened?
They had the supplemental draft back then, and they drafted Walsh with the supplemental.
Steve Walsh.
Steve Walsh, quarterback out of Miami.
Yeah, who had been Jimmy's national champion winning quarterback.
Right.
So then Dallas fans were like, wait a minute, we drafted Aikman. We know he's good, but we also drafted Jimmy's dude from Miami. I was confused. I was like, what is this all about?
Yep.
So I read Jimmy's book, and Jimmy said, well, you know, it's easy for him to say that after the fact, but he made it sound like in his book that was just a way to make sure he was stocked at quarterback. But if things went like he thought they would, he would dangle Walsh out there for trade bait, and that's what ended up happening.
And wasn't it also to like give Aikman a little, competition, not to get too cocky.
Yeah, and the thing is too, Steve, what really screwed everything up was Aikman was out there taking a beating. They're losing every game practically, and Walsh wins the one game of the year after Aikman gets so hurt that he can't play, and it's against the Redskins. They finally beat somebody. So Aikman didn't even get the win in the one game that they won that year. So they didn't even talk about that. They talked about Berline taking over and leading them into the playoffs, and I thought that was really an interesting choice, but I guess it's because the playoffs were involved. But do you remember, Casey, the Steve Berline thing?
Not until the documentary. I didn't realize
he was like the first really solid backup
Yeah.
quarterback they had. He'd been a starter for the Raiders.
I didn't realize that Aikman they kind of went with the hot hand, and Aikman could have played potentially, but they stayed with him.
It sounded like the Dak and Romo thing years later. I mean, they refused to not go with the hot hand, so Aikman had to ride it out on the bench, and then of course Berline stunk it up in the playoffs. Mark, you got anything about the Aikman Walsh thing that wasn't even in there? I'm throwing it out there anyway for historical purposes. You just remember that, but you do remember that being a deal. Yeah, it was a deal. I'm just trying to think. So, we know the Haylee thing happened, and the Minnesota picks turned out to be Emmitt Smith and a whole slew of guys, Emmitt being the main one. Y'all remember who Jimmy first picked one of his first picks other than Aikman. You know who one of his other first picks was? One of his own players from Miami. Y'all remember who that was? He ended up being a key piece of it. He's just not a name guy because he's one of them dudes that just did his job and just did it really well.
Was it a lineman?
Yeah, it was a lineman.
Russell Maryland?
Russell Maryland.
Yeah.
He's one of them dudes that the NFL said was too short. Jimmy disagreed and drafted him anyway, and he turned out to be a really good player for Dallas. So I always thought that was pretty cool. So they mess around. They go from 1-15 to 7-9, and then they go from 7-9 to 11-5 and make the playoffs. The Berline thing happens. They get knocked out of the playoffs, but by then, they go into that next year and they end up with Haylee and whatever. And so the next big point on the timeline to me happens to be the San Francisco game, because they talked about it in the documentaries. The changing of the guard had already happened with Dallas handing it over to San Francisco after the catch.
Right.
Dallas and Pittsburgh were the teams of the 70s, and you roll into the very early 80s, and Dallas is on the way down. The Niners are on the way up. They get the catch. They put Dallas out of the playoffs. They end up winning Super Bowls in the early 80s, and they were the team of the 80s. Clearly, they won like 4, didn't they?
Right.
So Dallas goes in there in 92. Niners were loaded. Dallas was loaded, and they did a good job in the documentary talking about that game. So for me as a Cowboys fan, that was a key game in the history of the franchise. What do y'all remember about that game that they talked about? I mean, I remember watching it. I saw what all happened, and it's fun to hear years later the thought process behind a couple of key things that went into that. Y'all remember that game?
Well, the field for one thing.
Yeah, it was terribly wet.
The field at Candlestick was always a mess anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was a factor in the game. So Casey, you remember the documentary what they did about the field conditions?
About charting off the worst spots and knowing what to avoid and where they could get good footing and that sort of thing was interesting.
Exactly. Jimmy went out there and walked it and made a chart of where the D-backs would have the most trouble churning and cutting, and they ended up using that later on to help to ice the game at least. One of the things that struck me, do y'all remember in that documentary all the great footage of the game? Not your typical TV feed footage, but the sideline footage and the what I call field level footage where they're in the dang end zone while the goal line play. They had some incredible footage and sound in that documentary, and all I can remember is how much hitting they were doing during that game. Those guys were pounding each other. They didn't like each other. They were the two most physically gifted teams. And I think Jimmy said in the documentary, we knew whoever won this game was the Super Bowl champion. There was no way.
Right. That was the Super Bowl. Those NFC championship games were the Super Bowl.
I just remember Emmitt, just the sounds of him running into the line and getting hit in the same way with, I guess it was Ricky Waters by the end for the Niners. But, man, they were really pounding each other. So, anyway, so Dallas goes on and wins that game, and that becomes the famous Jimmy speech where he said, what?
How about them Cowboys?
Yeah. So that gets you to the Super Bowl, and that was the year that they went to the Rose Bowl, Pasadena, which was funny because that was Aikman's turf from college. And they played the Buffalo Bills. I remember watching that game being nervous because Buffalo was just a scoring machine.
Right.
Thurman Thomas, Jim Kelly. Help me with some receiver names.
Reed, wasn't it Reed?
Reed, yeah.
The receiver, Reed. What was his first name? Reed. Anyway.
Andre Reed?
Andre Reed. Bruce Smith, defensive line.
Right. Who had a ton of sacks.
Yeah, they were loaded, man. They were loaded. And that turned out to be pretty quickly a disaster with the fumbles and sacks and all that kind of stuff. But
well, the Cowboys, didn't they start out slow? Weren't they behind for a little while?
It was slow. They certainly weren't.
I think they turned the ball over or something. And
could have been. And that was what was Michael Irvin's thing about the halftime entertainment that was so funny in the documentary? That was the year.
Was it that year?
That was the Pasadena year.
Michael Jackson.
Michael Jackson
snuck out of halftime.
Did you hear that part in the documentary, Mark? Yeah. Irvin was determined to see Michael Jackson play at the halftime show. So yeah, so that wins the Super Bowl for them. They come back and they win it again the next year with probably a better team. They go to Atlanta. They play. That year they played San Francisco, I believe, at home and got the NFC title. They go to Atlanta. It's a much different game in the first half. And what did they say in the documentary? Jimmy told them at halftime of the next Super Bowl against the Bills, when we come back out, we're going to do what? Ram it down their throat. And that was the famous drive where Emmitt touched it how many times in a row, and it was just basically the same play over and over and over, and the Bills just could not stop it. And so Emmitt finally scores. They go on and win like 30-13 or something, and James Washington had a scoop and score or something and helped them win. But anyway, so they win 2 Super Bowls in a row. Then the trouble starts, which is really the crux of the whole thing. So this has all kind of been background. What do y'all – so, looking back on it, how shocked were you guys that Jimmy left? And what do you remember? Do you remember Jimmy quit, or do you remember Jimmy got fired? I think that's one of the most important questions about all of this is, did Jimmy leave or Jimmy get fired?
Jimmy said, we have mutually agreed that I will not coach the Cowboys any longer.
That was at the press conference.
In my mind, he was fired.
What do you think, Casey? Was he fired or did he quit? And we'll go back to talk about what set this fire up in the first place.
Yeah, it sounded like firing to me.
What do you think?
I think he was fired. I thought he was fired anyway.
So one of y'all want to say what happened at
which was kind of shocking coming off of 2 Super Bowl wins.
Who's ever fired a
Right.
back-to-back Super Bowl champion coach? Nobody.
Well, I remember back then. I remember there being a spat between him and Jerry. Didn't really know the details.
Right.
And then
Pre-internet days.
I thought Jerry fired him.
Yeah.
No matter what they were saying, I thought he was fired.
And, of course, since then, books have been written and
Right.
all this. We now get more information. But anybody want to kind of summarize what happened at the league meetings in Orlando that happened that sort of kicked this whole parting of the ways off? Anybody want to kind of talk about that other than me, because everybody's sick of hearing me? What happened at the meetings?
Jerry walked in, saw.
By the way, league meetings mean all coaching staffs, all owners, all GMs, all under one roof at a hotel, meeting for league business, post Super Bowl in like March. So
Right.
Dallas has just won 2 Super Bowls. And go ahead, Mark. Sorry, I just want to make that clear.
Well, they were in Orlando at Disney World. Several guys were sitting with Jimmy, current coaches, ex-coaches,
Some ex-scouts.
ex-scouts, etc. And Jerry walks in, holds up his glass to toast Super Bowl champions. Jimmy didn't toast him back.
Right. And from what we've heard, Jerry's reaction to that was what? What did he do with the Dallas reporters?
Ed Werder and I can't remember the other guy's name.
Told him he was going to fire.
Told him, y'all don't leave.
Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah, he literally goes like whatever to the other end of the bar, the other side of the room, whatever it was, and told those guys, "Y'all about to get the story of the year because I'm about to fire that."
Well, they were about to leave.
Yeah, they were
late,
trying to leave.
late at night, and they were fixing to head out because nothing's going on. And Jerry tells them not to leave. That, well, why not? I'm about to fire Jimmy Johnson.
Was it Randy Galloway and
Callaway and Ed
Ed
Werder?
Werder.
Yeah.
He didn't call him Jimmy Johnson, though.
No, he called him something else. I'm about to fire that.
That sounds like a spur of the moment, or in the moment, in the heat of the moment decision.
So-
and I'm sure alcohol had played a part.
yeah,
So I'm actually confused about this because I know what happened. At what point did Jerry make the comment that 500 coaches could have just won those 2 Super Bowls? Because that happened in the same.
it was
Wasn't that in the press afterwards?
afterwards? I think.
After it was known that they fired him? Or
It's possible that after he fired him, he told the 2 guys that in the course of discussing it or something. I'm not sure. I'm really fuzzy on that, honestly.
I don't know. I just
But-
thought he said it in one of his press in press conferences.
Well,
things.
I don't know. It's just the point is that he tried to toast something Jimmy didn't want to toast. Jimmy spurned him. He goes back and tells these reporters, "I'm gonna fire him." And somewhere in all of that, a quote comes out that he didn't back down from. He got the opportunity to. For those of you who don't know, journalistic ethics tell you that when someone's quoted, you before you print it, you tell them back to their face what they told you, and if they are still okay with you quoting that, and they can then kill it if they, Jerry could have slept on it, because I think they said that. Jerry slept on some of this. They called him back, and he still said, no, I'm good. So somewhere in there was a comment that 500 guys could have coached this team. So
it had to have been something building up to, it couldn't have been a one thing. There had to have been other things leading up to that.
Yeah, so let's talk about some of the things real quick in the documentary that they both said were kind of creating the tension. One was the one that I found the most interesting was supposedly when Jerry allowed ESPN cameras in the draft room. To Jimmy, that was sacred ground. You didn't do that. And then the comment was, well, according to Jimmy, Jerry says, well, when we're about to make a pick, lean over here and let's look like we're having a unified conversation about what we're going to do so I'll look more involved. That's what Jimmy said. Jerry said that never happened. But what else do y'all remember about some of the contributing factors that led to this? The bottom line was what it involved was that Jimmy did not see Jerry as a football equivalent. That's kind of where all of this sort of centered on. And so how did some of those kind of things manifest? Like, for one thing, allegedly, Jimmy really did know the players he wanted to draft, and he didn't really care too much about Jerry's opinion on it. He just told him to sign the check. So that was one thing. And Jerry, of course, being the GM. Jimmy also said Jimmy had GM abilities in his contract, which I don't know how anybody would prove that one way or the other without a contract. But what else? Can y'all remember some of the other things that rubbed each other wrong, perhaps?
Well, Jimmy had been coaching for years.
Well, since he got out of college.
At this point.
By then, 30 years.
Jerry had been out of football.
Right.
For that many years. He was in business.
Right.
So Jimmy did not see him as a football person. He was a business guy.
Yeah, he didn't see him as an X and O equivalent, nor a scouting and drafting and talent acquisition equivalent. Correct.
But Jerry saw himself.
Correct.
In that spot.
Well, and I think it's one of the things. Well, Jerry was on a team with him, and he kind of in his own mind. Well, we were there together going through all that. We both learned all that stuff from Broyles, but he's not giving Jimmy credit for going off to Pittsburgh and going off to Oklahoma State and going off to Miami and learning what he learned under all these great coaches. So I think that was the key rub. I made the note that Jimmy never saw Jerry as a football equal. That's really where the crux of this lies to me. Okay. So were y'all happy when Jimmy left or not?
No.
So we've gone through, oh my God, they
How
fired.
could you be?
We've gone through, oh my God, they fired Landry too. What'd you run Jimmy off for? We just won 2 Super Bowls.
We're just getting started.
We're just getting started. Yeah, and what the most interesting thing about that was when Aikman said Jimmy left and Jerry truly did become the GM because of who he hired after that. The greatest quote was Troy saying, and then I realized Jerry's learning how to be a GM on my time. All right, everybody. I believe we're going to stop right there. Episode 31. We've gotten to the part where Jimmy Johnson's no longer the coach of the Cowboys, and instead of 2 weeks from now, in 1 week, the next Monday, we'll pick back up with episode 32, which will be part 2 of our discussion about Jerry Jones and the Dallas Cowboys, the Netflix documentary that discussed Jimmy and Jerry rebuilding the Cowboys. Until then, please please subscribe, and we'll talk to you in a week. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on GenX Classic Sports, where nostalgia meets the thrill of the game. Tune in next time for more insightful discussions and memorable moments, brought to you by Pine Street Productions. Until then, stay passionate about sports and keep the memories alive.